Talking about the ratchet effect. The ratchet effect means that nothing ever goes backwards. We don't evolve backwards, we evolve forwards. So if a social change has been made, then we never go back to the way it was before. That's kind of like the difference between progressivism and conservatism. Conservatism wants to slow things down, and progressivism wants to accelerate the change in societies. But if we look at humanity, if we look at other animals, what we see is that we very rarely will go backwards in evolution. However, it has happened, and we have seen it happen in select circumstances. It would be like if the individuals who ran the reservation decided that you would destroy all your cars and not allow electricity into your homes. You'd have to cook in wood fires, and you'd have to ride horses and whatnot. That just isn't going to happen. Things do not move backwards in time. But there have been some incidences where that has happened. To have a cumulative culture evolution, you need creative invention, reliable and faithful social transmission. High fidelity social transmission requires accurate imitative learning and sophisticated communication. And of course, that's what we have seen throughout the human evolution, especially European evolution. They developed a means of writing. They had magazines, they had books, and all of this information was passed from one person to the other. No species but humans have shown these capacities, the capacity to change, to evolve, to evolve in a positive direction. The larger the group of people, the better the cultural information can be maintained and improved upon. And this is one of the reasons why people from the city make fun of people from the country. Because people from the city, they live in an area where all the new information comes in first. People in rural communities, of course, they get the information last. Or if they get it at all, sometimes they don't change. So people from the cities tend to make fun of people from the country because they are more rural, they are more backwards. At least that's the idea. You're more likely to encounter a successful model to copy from out of a larger group than out of a smaller group. So if we're looking at countries, where innovative things happen, we're looking at the largest countries in the world. We're looking at the United States, we're looking at China, we're looking at Russia, Germany, France, all the larger countries, that's where all of the innovations come from. There will be more innovations that come from a larger group than from a smaller group. Very few things have been invented in Switzerland, Andorra, all of these really tiny countries, Luxembourg, these really tiny countries, we rarely see changes evolving in these countries. As a larger group will be more likely to have at least one person stumble onto a good idea as compared to a smaller group. We can look at the Polynesians in the South Pacific. The largest populations at the time of first contact had more different kinds of tools than islands with the smallest populations. So the larger the population, the more likely they would have discovered something that would have changed their society. They had a larger toolkit, as it were. Bigger populations allowed for more rapid spread of cultural innovations. And of course, these are the South Pacific Islands and the South Pacific Islanders. Some of the islands had fairly intricate populations, and others had much smaller populations where not a whole lot changed. However, sometimes the ratchet slips in a population will lose ideas. This happened with the Aboriginal population that inhabited Tasmania from the Australian mainland. This is Tasmania down here, and of course this is Australia. This is the Straits of Bass, or the Bass Straits in between the two. Aborigines from Australia went to Tasmania. And when they got to Tasmania, they lost some things. When the Europeans initially arrived in Tasmania, they found scattered foraging bands of humans utilizing the simplest technologies. Archaeological digs have shown that the technology seen in the past was far more advanced than what was demonstrated in their current technology. Comparing the Tasmanian Aborigines with those across the Bass Strait in Australia, the Tasmanians maintained a toolkit of only 24 items, whereas the Australians maintained a toolkit of hundreds of items. They had lost all of those things. Some of the things that they lost bone tools. They stopped making tools out of bones. They lost their cold weather clothing, even though it's colder in Tasmania than it is in Australia. They lost fish hooks, and they lost boomerangs. They lost all of these hunting and food acquiring capabilities when they went to Tasmania. But of course, they're not the only ones that have, where the ratchet has slipped. The Torres Islands, north of Australia, the individuals also lost some of their abilities to do things. The reclusive Siriano of Bolivia, the reclusive Paraha of Brazil, they also slipped backwards as far as evolution was concerned. Humans are a cultural species that exists within worlds consisting of cultural information that is accumulated over history. Cultural ideas greatly influence the ways that we live our lives, determining much of what we do on a daily basis. We are all born into rich cultural worlds, and we are constantly learning and being influenced by the shared ideas that make up our culture. And of course, that is one of the reasons why we have to say that humans are a cultural species. We adopt the culture that we live with. Race doesn't have anything to do with it. Ethnicity doesn't have anything to do with it. If I had been raised, as a matter of fact, I had a student when I was up at Fort Belknap. He was a white guy that married a native woman, but what happened was that when his mother was a drug addict, and she had a good friend who was native, and one day she brought all of her kids down to this lady. She had two sons and a daughter, and she brought those kids down to her friend on the reservation, and she said, you know, I've got a new boyfriend and he doesn't like kids, and I'm leaving them with you until I can come back. Well, these kids were toddlers. They were small kids, and she left them with this lady, and then she was killed. She died. And so this lady had her kids, and this lady raised her kids, her friend, her very good friend, and I mean, she didn't know, she didn't raise them like white people. She couldn't. She was living on the reservation. So she raised them as natives. And of those three children, two of them stayed on the reservation. The young lady, the girl, and one of the older boy stayed on the reservation. The other kid eventually left when he turned 16. He left the reservation and reclaimed his white ancestry. But the other two were not only raised as natives, but they were also treated as natives by the people in the community. So these kids grew up speaking the language, the Algonquian language of the White Clay people. They danced. Both of them danced. Both of them married natives. Despite the fact that they were white, they were culturally they were native. They were White Clay, and they were actually had a stronger connection with the White Clay people than they did. Than a lot of the White Clay people did, because most of the White Clay people couldn't speak their own language, but these kids could. These two white kids. As interesting as it is, so it doesn't really matter what you look like or whether you're the same as everybody else. It has to do with the culture that you were raised in. That's the most important thing. So we are a cultural species. Cultural ideas greatly influence the ways that we live our lives, determining much of what we do on a daily basis. We are all born into rich cultural worlds, and we are constantly learning and being influenced by the shared ideas that make up our culture. Our brain size is determined by the encephalization quotient, the ratio of the brain weight of an animal to that predicted by a comparable animal of the same body size. So we are humans, we weigh somewhere between 120 and 200 pounds. If you look at our brains and the size of our brains, we have a quotient, an encephalization quotient of 4.6, which means most other animals that are about our size have a much smaller brain than we do. We have a 4.6 times larger brain than any other creature that is about our size. Only the tiny but big brain shrew has a higher ratio than humans. They maintain a brain that accounts for 10% of their body weight. And of course, ours accounts for somewhere between 2 and 4% of our body weight. Our brains consume about 16% of our basal metabolism, even though our brains only represent about 2% of our body weight. Our brains weigh about 3 pounds. That's not that much, so you can figure it out yourself. The brain of the average mammal only consumes 3% of their basal metabolism. Ours consumes 16%. The brain of the marsupial, such as the possum, only consumes about 1% of their basal metabolism. So they're not really using a whole lot of energy to think, marsupials. But as humans, of course, it takes a lot of energy for us to maintain our large brains. So where in the world do we get large brains? Well, we don't have to have large brains, but it turns out that we do have large brains. In order to maintain our massive human brain, the trade-off was a shrinkage in other areas. If we look at chimpanzees, this is a chimpanzee right here, the chimpanzee's muscles are about 27% larger than humans. So if you think you're going to have a wrestling match with a chimpanzee that's about your size, you're going to get your butt whipped. It's just the way it works. The other thing about humans, if you look at the chimpanzee, he's got a fairly large abdomen here. Our guts are 60% smaller than that of the chimpanzee. That's why we have a flat stomach. Your gut is your stomach and your intestines, your large and small intestines. So if we look at the intestines of the chimpanzee, of course, he has his gut is about 60% larger than ours is. So he's always got a protruding abdomen, whereas we don't. We have a relatively flat abdomen. So how in the world, yeah, well, it's a good thing you're not a chimpanzee walking around like this. So how in the world can we do this? I mean, if everybody ate the same thing, could we possibly survive? And the answer is no. We had to figure out a way, with our big brains, we had to figure out how we could digest food better without this 60% intestinal tract. And this is how we did it. We figured out a way to digest foods that were different. We learned how to cook foods, and by cooking food, we accelerate the digestive process. Why do we do that? Because it denatures protein, breaks it down better. It also gelatinizes starches. And because of that, of course, we can digest food a lot more readily than animals can, than most animals can. Of course, if we cook it, it also makes our food softer. It's easier to digest if we cook it, and thus requiring less energy. My wife drives me crazy because when I was growing up, when we cooked vegetables, we cooked those vegetables so they're nice and soft and mushy. But my wife likes crunchy vegetables. So when she cooks it, she doesn't cook it all the way through. And so you grab a piece of cauliflower and you're gnawing on that sucker for ever. Celery, oh, Christmas drives me crazy. Anyway, my mom, when she cooked green beans, by golly, they were almost pudding by the time she was done with it. Of course, she mixed it with bacon grease and whatnot. Because she was raised during the Depression, when you put grease in everything, especially bacon grease, to give it a little bit more punch. Because of cooking, humans are able to consume foods that cannot be eaten raw. This reduced the amount of chewing necessary to consume food, reducing the amount of muscle required in the human jaw. It also changed the shape of our teeth. And as you can see, if we bite something, we're not going to hurt it too bad. But if a gorilla bites something, boy, I'll tell you what, with their sharp canines, they can rip a hole in your arm or whatever they're biting. But humans, of course, not really very good at biting things because our teeth are so flat. And the reason is because we use our teeth to chew with, to chew soft things. We can't chew hard things. The average human spends 1 hour chewing their food a day. I was reading this while I was eating a lunch. And my lunch consisted of 2 apples, 2 fruit cups, peaches of course, and 2 energy bars. That's what I had for lunch. And I was thinking, I don't chew an hour worth of food every day. That's just not the way it works. If I were a chimpanzee, however, they have to chew their food. I mean, they need to make their food soft enough so they can digest it. They chew their food for an average of 6 hours a day, as compared to us. Because we cook our food, we eat soft foods. We don't eat the chewy foods that chimpanzees eat. By cooking our food, we are able to evolve a much smaller digestive tract, which freed much energy to be used by our brains. And that's why we're so damn smart, because we eat soft foods, I guess. Many primates eat a lot of fruit. There's a good reason to eat fruit. Fruit's very healthy. It's rich in vitamins. It's got lots of carbohydrates in it. There's a lot of calories in it. There's fructose is sugar. Fruits tend to be available in concentrated patches. I mean, if you find an apple tree where the apples are ripening, boy, you could eat on that apple tree for about a week. Peach tree, pawpaw, banana, whatever you're eating, of course, you can eat for an extended length of time. To live off of a diet of fruit, you need to keep in mind where the various fruit trees are located and when they would likely be bearing ripe fruit. So when do apples ripen? Well, they start ripening at the end of August, beginning of September, and they will ripen all the way through November. So if you have an apple orchard of different types of apples, potentially you could stay there for 2 or 3 months and get enough fruit to sustain yourselves. Perhaps the greater need for a good memory and a big brain was triggered by the need to remember fruit locations. So you have to remember where all the fruit trees are. There are fruit trees all over the place. On my property is this huge mulberry tree. And this mulberry tree is probably 200 or 300 years old. It's really big and it's really messed up. But because of that mulberry tree is there's a bunch of little mulberry trees all over the place. Of course, we try to cut them all out, but they grow like, the birds eat the mulberries and then they plant the seeds. Wherever they land, they plant the seeds. So now we've got another mulberry tree that we had to cut out. Anyway, mulberries all over the place. So as long as birds eat it, like cherries, you got all these cherry trees, you've got mulberry trees, you've got raspberry bushes all over the place. This is up north, of course, not around here. Things don't grow down here like they do up north, where it's a lot more humid up there. Those primates that had better skills at remembering where the fruit was would have been more likely to eat well and to have surviving offspring than those who were stumbling around aimlessly trying to find ripe pawpaws. And this is what a pawpaw looks like, by the way. Pawpaws in American pawpaws are much smaller than that, but they're really sweet. They taste kind of like dates. We had pawpaws up in Indiana. I've never seen any in Iowa, but we used to have pawpaws. Ugh, they're nasty. They're like overripe bananas. That's what they taste like. That's what they look like too. But they're really, really sweet. A number of primate species rely on food sources that require a fair bit of ingenuity to access them. Some primate food sources include nuts and seeds encased in hard shells. How do you get the nuts out of the shells? You got to open those suckers up. Chimpanzees, other primates will bite them and break them open because their jaws are so strong. As humans, we can't do that. We break our teeth off. Tubers that need to be dug up. Of course, you need to know where those tubers are and what the plants look like. Chimpanzees have been known to eat termites. Termites are very nutritious food, but they have to fish them out of mounds. Termites usually will head back into the mound when they see something coming. So as the chimpanzees have learned to fish them out with stalks of grass. Extractive food sources such as the ones most mentioned are often worth pursuing because they're rich in protein and they have lots of energy. They represent lots of energy. Nuts and seeds, of course, have protein. The tubers have lots of starch. Termites, of course, are very rich. Insects are fairly rich. I was reading a book the other day about Nigeria, and they were talking about they had a locust came in, and everybody's just going crazy because locusts taste really good, I guess. They kind of taste like popcorn when you eat them.
Kind of like cashews.
Cashews, okay, well that's kind of interesting. I'm not much on eating bugs, but
We eat that here.
you guys used to eat, or you do eat
Yeah, we still do.
grasshoppers?
No, just locusts.
Oh, you mean the cicadas?
Yeah,
The
cicadas.
big one.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. I'm not much on eating bugs, like I said. But you can eat all the
It's
bugs.
actually good.
I'll save them all for you.
Try it. Just take off the wings and the legs and just
Pop
chop
them right in, huh?
It's kind of dry.
Yeah, I can imagine. Those primates who were able to extract nutritious foods were more likely to survive and produce viable offspring. And this is really what we're talking about, making babies and surviving. If you don't make any babies, you don't survive. If you do make babies, and theoretically those babies survive, now you've lived to the next generation. That's what the game's all about. Most primates live in complex social groups, maintaining clear power hierarchies, allowing them to form various relationships and alliances. Conflicts as well as cooperation, nepotism, and reciprocity are very common. So anytime you've got a group, this is what we see. We see cooperation. We see who do I want to survive the most? My people, my bloodline. That's who I want to see survive. And of course, we trade things back and forth, and that's what reciprocity means. Humphrey and Dunbar have hypothesized that it was the necessity to navigate through the intricate and elaborate webs of social relationships. We need to attract a mate. How do we do that? We need to secure resources. How do we do that? And protect ourselves and our offspring. And then the most important thing is that we have children and those children survive. That led to the development of the big brain. We needed to figure out how to do this in a society. And we needed to figure out how to do it differently than other animals because we needed larger and larger societies. The way that humans took over the earth is by expanding more and more and more. If we still lived in small clan groups, like some countries have, then potentially we wouldn't have survived. If you look at certain groups of individuals, the Basques, do you guys know who the Basques are? The Basques are a group of individuals that they have their own language, and it's not related to any other language, as odd as that may seem. They live along the coast in France and Spain, in the northern portion of Spain and the southern portion of France. That's where the Basques live. They were really kind of interesting people because theoretically, they were the ones who learned to navigate from Europe to the Americas. And actually the navigator that Columbus took on his ocean voyage was Basque. and he's the one that told him how to get over here. The Basque are fishermen, and they're also very closed-mouthed. So if they did something, if they knew something, they wouldn't tell anybody. And this is maybe one of the reasons. There may have been Europeans over here a lot earlier. Of course, we know about the Norsemen, but the Basques may have come over here much, much earlier than Columbus did. And the reason they didn't tell anybody was because the fishing was so rich across over the Grand Banks, over by Massachusetts, that area. So the Basques are this really interesting group of individuals, but they're really closed-mouthed. And they also are very clannish. They live in very, very small groups, and they weren't able to project any power. They were, they're relatively powerful men. They produced a lot of young. That wasn't the problem. The problem was that they couldn't form a country because they didn't cooperate with one another. Scotland was the same way. It was very, very clannish. And because it was so clannish, they weren't able to project their power and create a country. Eventually, of course, an Englishman came up, and he is the one that brought Scotland all together. He's the one that formed the country. It wasn't the people of Scotland that were able to do it. It was somebody from someplace else who came up and brought everybody together and was able to make a country. But nobody ever did that for the Basques. So the Basques are still there, and strangely enough, in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, there was a movement to free the Basques. The Basques were revolting, and they were blowing things up and whatnot. And so if you watch an old spy movie, they may talk about the Basques as terrorists, because they were blowing things up in Spain, they were blowing things up in France, trying to separate from France and Spain. But of course they weren't successful, because they were so clannish. They couldn't agree on anything. They were so jealous of each other that they just couldn't form a government. But they were very successful people, potentially. Dunbar analyzed the relationship between neocortex ratio and average group size, and estimated that the average size of the human ancestral population was about 147.8. That's a mathematical formula. Let's just say 150. So we've got this number, 147.8. It's a mathematical formula that he used, but then he looked at other things. They looked at subsistence societies still in existence, and Dunbar discovered that the average clan size was about 148.4. Well, mathematically, of course, he thought it was 147.8. But if we look at the average size of the Bushmen in the Kalahari Desert, any of the other subsistence peoples, we see villages about that average about 148.4. So 150 looks like a fairly accurate number, but we're not done. In 2011, Facebook did a survey of its accounts and found that the average number of friends that people had was between 120 and 130. When I dropped my Facebook account, I had 133 friends on my Facebook account. The same year, Twitter analyzed their accounts and discovered that people could maintain between 100 and 200 interactions. So we're getting pretty much the same number over and over and over again. Not only are we looking at old societies, but we're looking at it mathematically, we're looking at Facebook, we're looking at Twitter. And so what we determined was that any group that's larger than 150 people is too unwieldy. We can't manage more than 150 people. But if you think about all the friends that you have, if you count all the individuals that you interact with on a relatively normal basis, even the ones that aren't here but are the people that you communicate with, about 150 people. It turns out to be about 150 people. Any larger number than that, you just can't do it. Any number smaller than that, and it doesn't seem to mean anything. So we've got this number of 150. That's about how many people you can handle at one time, or handle in your lifetime. Although primates are highly social mammals, in many ways humans can be said to be an ultra-social species. Humans tend to be far more engaged with others around them than do any other primates. We're constantly attending to what others are doing. We care, we watch people, we wonder what they're doing. I'm walking through Walmart buying my groceries, and I'm watching all these other people around me. Because I care. I don't want them to, for one thing, I don't want them to run into me. I need to get through the aisles, so I gotta watch them to see which way they're going, see whether I can get past them or not. You know, we watch people. We gossip about others all the time. This is the most gossipy place I've ever been. No, it's not. The other reservation was the gossipiest place I've ever been. But I'll tell you, people talk about each other all the time. Our behaviors are guided a great deal by what others around us are doing, so we want to look like the people around us, we want to act like the people around us, we don't want to stand out. So we're very cognizant of what everybody's doing. We learn by imitating others. So, you know, I told you that I imitate my father because my father wore a suit every day, and here it is, he's been gone for, he's been gone for about 10 years, and I'm still wearing a suit, even though my dad's gone. He wore a suit for 50 years, and leather shoes, and he wore leather shoes all of his life, you know, wingtips and whatnot, and he ruined his feet. He really messed his feet up because he felt like that was the way you had to dress. So he wore these hard-soled shoes all the time, and it really messed his feet up. My mother was a nurse, and she wore nurses' Oxfords because when she was first in nurses training, they wore white nurses' outfits. They all had the nurses' hat on. They wore capes instead of coats. You couldn't wear a coat, you had to wear the cape. And they wore nurses' Oxford. Nurses' Oxfords were kind of pointy-toed, and my mother has a wide foot with wide toes. And what happened was she's jamming her foot down into that shoe, and it made her, she had to curl up her toes. So her toes crossed. So the last years of her life, her toes were crossed over each other because those were the shoes that she wore. I had a cousin when I was, as I was growing up, and in order for her to look the way that she wanted to look, first of all, she was a really short lady. She was only 4'7", 4'8". She was a little bitty tiny thing, but she wore high heels, and she wore high heels every day. If she wore slippers, she wore slippers that were high heels, and she wore high heels to the extent that she couldn't go barefoot anymore. She had to wear high heels. They had to have a heel on them. And they were fairly tall heels too. So the poor thing, she gets into her 80s and 90s, and here she is, she's walking around on her tiptoes because she can't walk on her heels. She is walking on her heels as long as she's on her, in a high-heeled shoe, but she couldn't walk without her high-heeled shoes on. Why? Because we imitate others. We think that's the way to be. And of course, all three of my relatives ruined their feet because they tried to imitate everybody else. Now, I try to wear the most comfortable shoes I possibly can. I don't care. You guys can wear all the cowboy boots you want, but those damn things are really uncomfortable as far as I'm concerned. The soles are there. It's got a high heel on it. The soles are hard. The toes are pointed. I can't wear that. My foot is shaped like a fan. You know, I've got a big fat, I'm sorry, did I say fat? I meant wide. I have a wide foot. So my toes are splayed out like this. So I need a wide toe box. That's why I wear running shoes all the time. I've got, well, I'm not going to show you my shoes, but I can't wear your boots, your damn boots. Those things are just too uncomfortable for me. And I just wonder why people actually wear those things, because they're just ridiculously uncomfortable as far as I'm concerned. And I'm not gonna die not being able to walk around. Not gonna be 105 years old, not being able to walk around. I'm still gonna be jogging on my toes in my running shoes. I'll be the happiest guy in the whole wide world, I think. Dean et al. In 2012 did an experiment looking at 2.5-year-old children, human children, and orangutans and chimpanzees. He needed to compare their intellectual capacity. So he assumed that a chimpanzee was about intellectually equal to a 2.5-year-old child, as well as an orangutan. Chimpanzee, they're both great apes, of course, but this one is an ape and this one's a chimpanzee. So we were trying to figure out, he was trying to figure out if they were equally intelligent. The child and the great apes, he did 2 experiments. One had to do with a physical problem, solving a physical problem, and the other had to do with a social problem. The child and the great apes performed equally well on the physical problem at about 75%. So they got all 3 of them got C's on the physical problem. However, for the social problem, when the subject had to follow a model, the 2.5-year-old was more likely to follow precisely what the model did. I'm sorry, that's from the, well, it's a human and an ape, okay? So, there we go. He's dead, so we don't care about
There is no
him
Planet of the
kissing.
Apes, huh?
Planet of the Apes, one of the great movies of all time. The great apes tried to solve the social problem through emulation. The child was able to imitate directly what the other person did. And then they used that information in other social problems. As it turned out, most of the humans scored 100% on the social problem, while the apes scored 0%. So here we are, we're smarter than apes as far as our society is concerned. Our society is more extensive than theirs is. We imitate more. If you go to France, you're not going to see a lot of people, almost everybody's going to have on very, very similar clothes. It's because we're able to imitate people that are outside of our group. Whereas a chimpanzee or a gorilla or an orangutan, they will only imitate people in their group. That's the only people that they will try to emulate. So we have greater possibilities of imitating other individuals. So no matter how reclusive an individual or a group of humans are, culture and biology of the human brain are bound inextricably. Our culture is bound to who we are. And as you can see, this is really kind of an interesting picture. This is an Aboriginal group from the Amazon Valley, as you can see, or Amazon River. As you can see, this guy's got on flip-flops and he's wearing glasses. Well, okay. So he is a member of his group. He's painted like the people in his group, but here he is, he's wearing Western flip-flops and he's wearing glasses. It's kind of funny. Humans evolved as a cultural species, and the reality is we adopt from the people around us, just like the Navajo have done. You guys adopt a lot of things from the people that you were around. A lot of your spirituality you borrowed from the Hopi. Your farming practices you borrowed from the Hopi.
Pueblo? Pueblo?
The Pueblos, yeah. Well, Hopi or a Pueblo tribe. Okay, you borrowed it from San Carlos, okay? It wasn't the Hopi at all, it was San Carlos. Or Laguna, maybe it was San Juan. Maybe it was a Zuni, I don't know.
No, it was the Pueblo. We have nothing to do with the Hopi,
Nothing?
except Peaky Bread. And,
Huh.
yeah.
Isn't that amazing? They're right here and you didn't even see them the whole time they were.
But the Hopi and are descendants of are also, the Hopi and the Pueblo are also descendants of Anasazi.
Well, here you are, you're saying that you're using the word Pueblo, and that's really kind of fascinating.
Yeah.
because that's just, is a general term for all those guys that lived in Pueblos. Pueblo, of course, is a Spanish word. They speak 6 distinct languages,
Yeah, they're all descendants of Anasazi.
potentially.
Yep.
And you guys are?
No,
Okay.
we're at the basking,
I know you're out of baskets,
but then overall,
there were arguments as to who,
but then according to Dene College, we grew out from the ground like a corn stalk.
you grew out of cornstalk.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, well, that's one way to do it, I guess. Well, let's talk about cultural evolution and not argue about whether you guys stole anything from the Hopis or not. With Kokopelli, isn't he a deity from the Hopis? He's not?
I think it's wrong.
We dispute with them, that's why we don't,
Oh.
So,
yeah.
Oh, okay. So since you don't like him, then,
No, they don't like us.
oh, they don't like you.
Yeah.
Okay, that's- I don't think that's true, but that's okay. I mean, they seem to be fairly friendly people. Different environments affect the ways that people go about living their lives. So if you live in one environment, if you live in this environment, the desert environment, you will evolve in one way. The people that live where I live, or the people that lived up there, of course, they developed differently than you guys did. They didn't have to worry about such a hot summer. They could grow lots of food all until October, November. That's when harvest time came. They would store it. They would hunt buffalo. Buffalo didn't really come down this far. Well, I guess they did sometimes. You guys hunted some buffalo.
Yeah, that's why there's a place called Buffalo Pass here.
I know you guys call it buffalo. You know, the buffalo, they're heading down here, they're going, you know, I know this is a desert and there's no grass here, but let's go down there anyway, okay? The Great Plains are just full of grass. It's just full of places to eat, and here they are. Okay, well, we won't argue with that. So if you live in a different environment, you evolve differently. The Sioux, that group of Lakota, Nakota, Dakota, all these different languages, they didn't start out as a plains tribe. They weren't really buffalo hunting people. They lived in the woodlands on the other side of the Mississippi River. That's where they started from. And then, of course, as soon as Europeans got here, they started pushing everybody west, and they moved out into the plains. Eventually, they moved out into the plains. But while they were in the woodlands, they were one type of people, and then when they moved out, they started, they were living in bark huts and whatnot when they were in the woodlands. As soon as they moved out onto the plains, they started building teepees and whatnot. Some of the ways that physical environments affect culture are quite direct. There are no large indigenous mammals on the Hawaiian Islands. If you go to Hawaii, you don't find any big animals to hunt. And because of that, the Hawaiians don't have any hunting tradition. They're fishing for relatively small fish. They didn't hunt whales. They didn't hunt seals. The largest animal they had on the island was the goose. This ninny goose. And if you look at trumpeter swans or Canada geese or snow geese, they're fairly large. Well, the geese on the Hawaiian Islands look like ducks. I mean, they're that tiny. They're just not very big, but of course, they are descended from geese. So there's not a whole lot to hunt on the Hawaiian Islands. So they have no hunting traditions on the Hawaiian Islands.
I thought,
I'm sorry?
I was wondering why they eat pig though.
Well, where did pigs come from? The Europeans, of course. The Europeans, they carried those pigs with them wherever they went.
Oh, I thought.
They're the ones who,
I thought they had their own javelinas or something.
no.
Oh, okay.
Where did the javelinas come from? Javelinas came from wild pigs. Wild pigs that evolved from the pigs that the Europeans brought over here. There were no pigs here until the Spanish decided that they were going to bring them over here. Horses, pigs, cows, there's no cows over here. There were buffalo and antelope, I mean, there were those type of herbivores, but there weren't any cows. And there weren't any pigs, so, and there weren't any sheep, except for the mountain sheep, which aren't even close to the same genetic structure. Okay, so if we look at the Hawaiian people in the Hawaiian Islands, they've got all these small animals. They're eating fairly well because they're eating a lot of birds. They're eating a lot of birds' eggs. They eat a lot of fish. Hama hama nuka nuka apawa'a. If you've ever seen that fish, it's about this big. The hama hama nuka nuka apawa'a. It's a really colorful yellow and black striped fish on the Hawaiian Islands. But if you go down to the Kalahari Desert, you run into the Bushmen. The Bushmen are relatively light complexion. You've got people that are black African who are very, very relatively dark. And then you have the Kung, and their skin tone, if you take them out of the sun and they just sit there for a while, for a couple months, then they look almost yellow. That's their skin tone, is that color. Anyway, the Kung are the Bushmen of the Kalahari, and they hunt all of these huge animals, including elephants. They will hunt an elephant if they can find them. And because of that, the large animals are most of their caloric intake, are these large animals. They have a strong hunting tradition because they hunt very, very large animals. So they have a strong hunting tradition. The kinds of foods that are available within a given ecology affect the kinds of foraging behaviors that people engage in. Rodents are relatively easy to catch. Where I come from in Indiana, we used to hunt squirrels all the time. We used to hunt rabbits. They were fairly abundant at that time. You guys ate field mice?
No. Prairie dogs?
You ate prairie dogs?
A squirrel. Some people will eat like...
Kangaroo rats?
No.
Yes, you did.
No, not rats.
Sure you did.
No.
Why not? It's meat. Why wouldn't you eat it?
No, it's not.
If you're going to eat prairie dogs, which are probably the
It's not a
nastiest
common
things
thing.
you can possibly eat, the Inca used to eat guinea pigs. That's where guinea pigs come from. They come from South America. And they used to eat guinea pigs. And when I was down there, they'd let them run around their houses. And then if they were hungry, or if they were, if important enough people were coming over for dinner, they would grab a couple of them and they'd pull the heads off, or they would just kill them and skin them, and then they'd eat them. I had guinea pig when I was there. Of course, guinea pig, that's pretty close to a rat.
Yeah.
And so are squirrels, and so are rabbits. They're pretty damn close to
It
rats.
was all, everything bigger than a mouse we were gonna eat, because mice were always considered to be
Hantavirus?
no, it's just, it's considered to be something of a form of poverty.
Something like a bad luck.
Yeah, it's like bed bugs.
So which means there were some people eating them, because
No.
that's all they could get.
No. You either eat a squirrel, raccoon, prairie dog,
Rabbit.
groundhog.
What kind of squirrels you
Rabbit
guys-
especially, rabbit and prairie dogs were one of the most common foods to eat. Some people have eaten foxes, some people have eaten, well, a lot of them have eaten bears, but it's not really much of a good tasting meat, they say. Then cougars, some of them ate cougars and bobcats as well too. There are still some people who eat that stuff. Very, just in the woods, I guess.
I guess when you're hungry, you'll eat just about anything that comes along.
A long time ago, I guess they just eat that. Horses too.
Well, I had to wait till horses got here. They didn't get here until.
No, we actually had smaller horses, they say.
Right, but that was before humans were here. They all died out before humans got here.
I believe that would be right around after the Anasazis had passed away.
No.
But they say that, yeah, but then in reality, where do these Navajo songs of horses come from? Because they said they originated before the English or the European concept.
Well, if you ask Emory, it has to do with coming across the land bridge, because they did have them over there. They had them in Asia.
Yeah. So I think
So,
that's one way
the
they
whole,
brought
all the
down
horse
here.
traditions that come before the Spanish got here had to do with when you were on the other side of the land bridge. That's what he says.
There could be possibilities, but then they said that there were still horses here though. They might have been.
There were horses here, but they all died out long before humans got here. Even before humans evolved, they were gone. Other things were eating them. Cougars.
But yeah, they ate horses.
Jaguar.
And, let's see, what else was it? Some birds,
Sure.
a lot of turkey, wild turkey.
Wild turkeys all over the place. You guys used to raise wild turkey, or you used to raise turkeys.
Yeah. And
And that's one of the reasons why the southeastern tribes died out, was because the pigs and the turkeys have very similar immune systems, and the diseases went from the pigs and the Spanish to the turkeys, and then the turkey population started declining, but the natives in the southeast were still eating them, and they got sick. That's where the diseases spread, because,
Oh.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah, there's a lot of interesting things taking place.
But we didn't eat rats, mice.
Oh, okay. Yeah, right. And I've never eaten squirrel or rabbit either, or snakes.
Our brain told us not to.
Okay. Maybe your brain today is telling you you shouldn't eat them, but I've eaten snake,
You did?
of course.
I know some people who've eaten snake.
And possum, I've eaten possum and raccoon. You guys, it's just a tradition, you guys don't eat snake. I mean, that's
Yeah.
one of your taboos, but, I mean, a lot of people eat snake around the world.
Yeah.
A lot of people eat snake. It's kind of bitter. It tastes like, it's meat soaked in vinegar is what it tastes like. What it tasted like to me. Anyway, it's kind of like an amphibian. It's kind of like eating frog's legs, or, I don't know, what you guys.
I know down in Miccosukee, Florida, Everglades, I know that those Seminoles down there, they eat stuff like that.
They eat gators.
Alligators, turtles.
Oh, sure, they'll eat anything. 'Cause,
Yeah.
I mean, if you're hungry enough, you'll eat whatever's there. Yeah, I had a good friend who was a Seminole. She was from Oklahoma. According to Gilmore 1990, in those cultures where the environment is harsh and requires courage and physical prowess to secure a living, cultures of masculinity that value the strength and the toughness of males are more likely to emerge. So if we had a violent culture like they had in New Guinea, the place where the Sambia came from, if we had that type of a culture, of course, the only way to survive is to create a warrior culture, and that's exactly what happened with the Sambia. They needed to create the warrior culture, so they had all of those very strange practices that, of course, as Western men, we do not practice those things. But they needed to create warriors, and this is the way they did it. So any place where it's a dangerous and a fragile environment, you're going to have a warring, more violent group of individuals. Places where large game is hunted, like the buffaloes of the there was a southern herd and a northern herd. The buffalo, very good meat, nice and lean. Places where risky deep sea fishing is performed, you have a culture of masculinity. On the South Sea island of Truk, men traditionally had to go on dangerous deep sea fishing expeditions to secure food for their family, and because of that, the idea of masculinity, the idea of being the strongest and the biggest and the meanest was very important. As a matter of fact, the Truckies did value masculinity to the extent that they would fight each other from time to time with knives and clubs, and they would have these violent confrontations. It was really kind of interesting when I was in the service. I'm not a fighter. I'm more of a lazy person. Anyway, when I was in the service, I had a friend who was Cajun, and he was from Louisiana, and he lived on the boats, and he wandered through the swamps and whatnot. And I thought he was my friend, and of course, and we were friends most of the time, but this one day he got pissed off at me, he got real upset with me, and he stabbed me with a knife. And I can show you the scar, and the next time you're at the gym and I'm at the gym, I'll show you. We were there the other day, last Thursday. I'll show you my scar where he stabbed me in the stomach. Why would he do that? He was my friend before, he was my friend afterwards. Why did he become so violent? It's because that's the culture that he grew up in. If somebody makes you mad, you had to gain retribution against them. And he stabbed me in the stomach with a knife. Luckily, it didn't, I can show you the scar. Luckily, it didn't penetrate a whole lot of stuff, but it didn't hurt me very. It went in about this far, and of course, he could have killed me. And I kind of lifted up when he came at me, and I thought he was just threatening me, but he just gouged me. And I was more shocked than anybody was. And he was mad. He was still mad. He drew back and he was going to stab me again. Luckily, I was a little stronger than he was, and I was able to wrestle the knife out of his hand. But he was my friend, and neither of us were. I don't drink. I didn't drink then, and he hadn't been drinking. That wasn't the problem. The problem was I had disagreed with him about something that was so important to him that he got angry to the extent that he had to attack me. And it's because the environment that he grew up in, people didn't do that to you. If they did that to you, you had to fight them. And he stabbed me in the stomach. Well, he stabbed me right here. Wait a minute, I can find it. It's right there. In cultures where the environment is more benign and food is plentiful and more easily acquired, more androgynous gender roles are more likely to emerge. And of course, this is one of the things we talk about. Wait a minute. Well, we refer to people that live in cities as not nearly as masculine as people that live outside of cities. I raised my kids in Nebraska, where it's a farming community and it's kind of tough. There's lots of sports being played. My daughter went from Virginia down to Florida, and she was there for an extended length of time. She said, "Dad, these men are just kind of sissies." Well, it's an urban area. I mean, the whole area is urban. And most of the people that she was around were people from the Northeast. They were people from New York and Boston and Baltimore and whatnot. And she said, "Dad, they're just not very masculine. I can't find a boyfriend because these men, I'm more masculine than they are." Of course, she was raised in Nebraska. These guys were from either the Northeast or they were from Florida. And so they had a whole completely different mindset than she had. I mean, they put on more makeup than she did. They'd get their fingernails manicured. Well, who the hell does that in Nebraska? Or anyplace else. Anyway, so if you're someplace where you don't have to worry about fighting for food, then you don't fight for food, and people don't fight. And that's what happens on the island of Tahiti. Tahiti is surrounded by all these lagoons. Well, because the water is warmer, there's a lot of fish, and this is where the fish spawn. This is where they have whole schools of fish out here. They have no problem finding food. In the Truck Islands, they don't have lagoons, so they have to go out into the ocean, and it's a struggle to survive. But on Tahiti, there is no struggle. So the men aren't nearly as masculine as the men on the Truck Islands. I mean, they look the same. There's virtually no warfare and feuding on Tahiti. What would you fight about? You got all the food you want. You got all the fish you want. You've got all the fruit trees and whatnot. Why in the world would you fight? There's little evidence that masculinity is a matter of much concern with Tahitians. The harsher the environment and the scarcer the resources, the more manhood is stressed. The environment shapes your lifestyle, the reality is. So potentially out here in the desert, it was a hard life for you guys. So masculinity was fairly important. So you developed a warrior society, or a raiding society.
Which is why I wear boots.
That's why you wear those really uncomfortable boots. It's going to kill you, but you're going to still wear those boots. I've got on boots, but mine are more comfortable than yours.
You have no idea what kind of soles are in here, so.
Are they soft? Are they comfortable? Okay.
I got some Dr. Scholl's in there,
I
so.
won't make fun of you then. Patrick Blackwater wears cowboy boots, I swear. I don't know how in the world he walks out around on those things. They've got those Spanish heels on them that are like this big around, but they're, you know, oh geez, I don't know. They're for riding horses.
Yeah, the heels are pretty steep.
Yeah.
These ones.
That's, and I tell him that too. It doesn't make any difference. In 1532, Juan Pizarro and 168 soldiers met with the Incan Emperor Atahualpa and captured the emperor and killed 7,000 Incan warriors, 168 soldiers. Why were they, what was about these individuals that made them able to kill 7,000 Incan warriors? These were Incan warriors. We're not talking about, you know, the guy walking along the street. These were the bodyguards of the emperor. Within a year, the Spaniards won battle after battle against impossible odds and conquered the Incan Empire. So how the hell did that happen? Why in the world were they able to do that? And of course, the Incan Empire wasn't the only empire they conquered. They also conquered the Aztecian Empire. They also conquered the Mayan Empire. They conquered all of these native empires. And how were they able to do it?
Swords and guns?
You can put 5 arrows into somebody before he can reload his damn rifle. So it couldn't have had anything to do with guns. Proximal means direct and immediate. Proximal cause of the Spanish success would be the Spanish political organization drew on 1,000 years of written history, ocean-going ships, steel swords and armor. They had horses, whereas the Incan, of course, didn't have any. And of course, their diseases decimated the Incans. As a matter of fact, Atahualpa wasn't the emperor when the Spanish first landed. It was somebody else who was a warrior king. And then Atahualpa was the guy second in charge. Well, if you know anything about the Incans, they didn't really train their offspring to be warriors, because if they did, they would overthrow them. So the Incans didn't really do that. And so this guy had like 2 weeks of training before the Spanish got there, and of course they were just massacred.
Atahualpa?
Atahualpa.
What?
Atahualpa. Atahualpa.
Atahualpa?
Yeah, there it is. Atahualpa. I know.
I thought you were talking about El Guapo
El Guapo?
and Three Amigos.
Yeah. That means the fat guy. Distal means long-term and indirect. The Spaniards came from a history of environments with food sources that supported large populations. The Fertile Crescent in the Middle East, they grew wheat, barley, peas, and lentils. They raised sheep, goats, pigs, donkeys, and cows, as well as horses. Such strong agricultural endeavors enabled the formerly nomadic people to adopt more sedentary lifestyles, which in turn allowed them to seek scientific improvements, and they grew these large cities. And of course, the indigenous peoples actually did have relatively large cities. If you go to St. Louis, there's a mound outside Cahokia, outside of St. Louis. The mound is huge. This is just gigantic. It supported a city of about 30,000 people in that area, around the St. Louis area. And of course, it's great agricultural land, so they could grow all the food that they wanted. But eventually, of course, it broke down because of drought. The domestication of various animals allowed the people in the Eurasian area to live in close proximity with animals for thousands of years. And what do we have? Things to eat: sheep, goats, pigs, donkeys, cows to eat, and donkeys, of course, for labor. But they also drank donkey milk. Because of this proximity, diseases developed and were traded back and forth between the Eurasians and the animals, so that animal diseases now affected humans. And this is what happened. They domesticated all these animals, and all of a sudden they started coming down with the same diseases that the animals had: measles, tuberculosis, smallpox, influenza. For thousands of years, diseases swept through the cities and towns of Eurasia, killing off millions, but leaving populations of people immune to these scourges. And I keep telling you guys that white people are professional drinkers. They are professional drinkers. They've been drinking for thousands and thousands of years. So the people that would have died out because they couldn't handle their booze or whatever, who had weak livers or who had weak kidneys, they fell out of the gene pool. And so it was like selective breeding. Let's all get drunk and see who's alive at the end. They did this for thousands and thousands of years. So Europeans can drink a lot of alcohol without any damage, not nearly as much damage as you guys, because you guys have only been drinking for 400 years. Well, more than that, about 600 years, 500 years. When these diseases were introduced to the uninitiated populations in the Americas, the lack of immunity wiped out whole nations. I mean, literally, it wiped out all of the natives who lived in the southeast. All those tribes, all those Mississippian mound builders there, they all died out. Whatever tribes that DeSoto saw coming across as he was going from Florida to Kansas, all those tribes, because of his pigs, they all died. They were gone. The next time anybody went into that area from Europe and chronicled what was happening, there weren't any people there. They were all dead. They had all died out. If you have read the story of the Pilgrims who landed at Plymouth Rock, why in the world were they able to find any place to live? The Europeans had been wandering in that area and they said it's wall-to-wall people. There's no place to live out here. And then the Pilgrims land and there's nobody there. What happened to them? Well, they died. They died of the diseases that the Europeans had given them. As a matter of fact, they lived off of the graves. They're not cannibals or zombies or anything, but they used to bury their dead with foods. And what they did, they dug up the graves, the native graves, and they ate the food that they found in the graves. That's how they survived the first year. They landed in November. What's the probability that they had enough food to feed everybody in November? Well, they didn't. They ate the food that they found in graves. They were grave robbers. As weird as that sounds. Now here's the bizarre part. I have ancestors who were pilgrims. Actually, well, they were pilgrims. The pilgrims thought that they were superior religiously to everybody else. That's why they came over here, because, well, they didn't want to be around all those crazy Catholics and all those other Protestant people. So they thought that they were superior to everybody else. They became the Puritans. So when they landed, these were kind of the rich people, and they were the Puritans, and they didn't do anything. So they had to hire other people on the ship to do all the work for them. So the guys that were doing all the work were not pilgrims. They were laborers, and they called them the sinners. So they had the saints, who were the actual pilgrims, and then they had the sinners. And I have ancestry I had a sinner. The male was a sinner, and the female was a saint. But they got together because, well, there weren't any people left. After the first year, a lot of horrible things happened. Anyway, so it wiped out a lot of people. If you talk I was on Fort Belknap Reservation, the White Clay people, the Grovon, the Ani Nin, they talk about when the French first got there, that they had 600 lodges, and each lodge had about 20, 30 people in it. They had 600 of them, and by the time the smallpox swept through their area, that they only had 60 left, 60 lodges left. Not only that, they didn't have any place to bury. So many people died so fast that they didn't have any place to bury them. And they used to bury them up in the Little Rocky Mountains. They used to bury them up in the rocks, but there were no more places left, so they had to stick them up in trees, the dead bodies. That sounds nasty, doesn't it? They didn't have any more places to bury people.
Sounds like some of those horror movies.
Yeah, it's kind of like a zombie apocalypse, I guess. Yeah. Anyway, yeah, And they still talk about it to this day. Okay. China is a large country in Eastern Asia. If you know anything about China, this is China. There's a reason why this is pink and this is yellow. This is the yellow portion is where they eat rice, and the northern portion is where they grow it and eat wheat. So if you go to China, everybody thinks rice equals China, but the reality is only the people along the coast eat rice. That's where it's humid. It's actually kind of cold up in this region. It's more temperate. It's more like Iowa or Kansas or Nebraska or whatever. In the north, the people eat and grow wheat. In the south, it's warmer and it's more humid, and they eat rice. Because there's a vast difference between growing rice and wheat, the two areas have developed different social structures. It's kind of like what happened during the Civil War. The people in the north were in a more temperate climate. They grew corn, they grew wheat, they grew barley, they grew food grains. So what did they grow in the south? Well, because they could, they grew tobacco and they grew cotton. And they made lots of money off their tobacco and cotton. So they developed completely different societies. And they were always at odds with one another. Because in the north, you could live off of a small farm. You could grow, you had livestock, you had all your grains, and you could live off of that. But in the south, they grew cotton and they grew tobacco. And because of that, and because they're so labor intensive, they needed slaves in the south, and they didn't need slaves in the north. And this became a point of contention and led to the Civil War in 1861. That's when the Civil War started. Anyway, so China's kind of the same way. The people in the south and the people in the north aren't anything alike. Rice is cultivated in paddies. If you've ever been to that portion of the world, you see a lot of rice paddies. Korea has rice paddies, Vietnam has rice paddies, Laos has rice paddies, China certainly has rice paddies. There are rice paddies in southern Japan. There has to be sufficient rainfall where it is channeled through irrigation canals. This requires a great deal of coordination and cooperation between farmers. Rice farming is labor intensive. It often requires the work of whole families, of whole villages in order to have a rice crop. And this is what we saw in Vietnam. The whole village would plant rice. The whole village would harvest rice. The whole village did anything that had to do with the rice. Everybody had to do it, otherwise they wouldn't survive. Wheat farming is done in fields that rarely require irrigation. Wheat farmer does not have to cooperate with his neighbors. Wheat farming is far less labor intensive. The way they plant wheat is they just kind of broadcast it like this. They'll walk along and they'll just broadcast. Then they'll look down at the ground and see how far out they have thrown the wheat, and then they'll move over, and then they'll start broadcasting in the other direction. And that's how they plant wheat. Of course, we do it differently in the United States. It's all mechanized in the United States. Looking at the people from northern and southern China, researchers discovered that rice growers from the south showed more interdependent thinking styles. In other words, they had to cooperate, they had to coordinate things. So the people in the south are far more collectivist than the people in the north. They're more individualistic. They saw themselves as part of a network. The northern or the southern Chinese, they were tolerant of nepotism, lots of nepotism. So if you go to southern China, they talk about their families all the time. In the north, they don't really do that. They engaged in more holistic reasoning. And if you watch, this is really fascinating because the Chinese make fun of each other. The northerners make fun of the southerners because the southerners are like, they say they're like ducks following, the mama duck, and they all walk the same, and everybody does the same. Everybody wants to look the same. It's just bizarre. They do actually look very, very much different. This lady is Southern Chinese, and this is a Northern Chinese person. They don't even speak the same languages. One speaks Cantonese, and the other speaks Mandarin. And of course, there's lots of dialects in China, but those are the two main dialects, and one has to do with the individualistic Northern Chinese, and the other has to do with the more collectivistic Southern Chinese.
So they don't speak Chinese language?
There's several Chinese languages. The two main Chinese languages are Cantonese and Mandarin. Oh, yeah. They don't even look the same. As you can see, these two women don't really look alike. This lady's from northern China and this lady's from southern China. The southern Chinese say that northern Chinese women are arrogant. They think they're more beautiful than anybody else. And it's just, there's this huge argument going on in China that we don't even have a clue. You know, we think all Chinese look alike and they all act the same. Nothing could be farther from the truth. They have all these negative things about each other, just like you guys in the Hopis.
No, it's actually like us here in the res, and Navajo's here, and Navajo's down in Phoenix.
Ah, there you go. City Navajos and Res Navajos. Evoked culture is the idea that people, no matter where they are from, have certain biological encoded behavioral patterns that can be evoked when a certain circumstance arises. When threatened, the capacity to act in an intimidating manner is universally present. So if somebody attacked your family, you would all of a sudden puff up and try to defend your family. That's universal. It happens wherever you go. So if you attack somebody's children, if you attack somebody's significant other, then they will try to fight you off. No matter whether they come from Tahiti or whether they come from the Truk Islands, whether they're northern Chinese or southern Chinese, they will try to fight you off. Another example of evoked culture is attractiveness in a mate. People around the world prefer mates who are physically attractive. Attractive people are less likely to have parasites. Attractive people are healthier. Thus, humans have inherited preferences for attractive mates. So we're always looking for attractive mates. Except my wife, and she couldn't see very well, so she got me, my poor wife. When there is a little threat from parasites or an unhealthy environment, other criteria can be used to select a mate. Intelligence, kindness, sense of humor, there's lots of different criteria that we use. But if it's a dangerous environment, all we care about is health, is healthy offspring. In areas that are unhealthy, attractiveness is of prime importance, of course. So if we go someplace that's dangerous, the most beautiful person in the group is seen as the individual that everybody pursues. But if it's a safe environment, then we start thinking of other criteria that we are looking for: intelligence, kindness, and sense of humor. Now, it's really kind of interesting coming out of high school because a lot of individuals are more in that dangerous environment. High school environments are not really that safe. When you get out in society, things are a little bit different. So if you marry right out of high school, a lot of times, the only thing that you're looking for is attractiveness. And so a lot of people get hooked up with individuals that aren't very nice, individuals that are abusive. They may be good, nice looking, but they turn out to be kind of jerky people, unfortunately. If you wait until you're a little bit older, then you're looking for something else in a spouse. Intelligence, kindness, and sense of humor, of course, these become very, very important. I read a lot of this stuff. You guys, you have those discussion questions. And I read a lot about people getting married right out of high school, and then they didn't realize what a horrible jackass the guy was. And he became abusive, and he started messing around, all of this stuff. Well, it's because as high school people, our teenage mind is completely different than our adult mind because the environment is different that we're living in. High schools are relatively hostile environments. So you're more likely to pick, to go for the cheerleader. Because how does that person becomes a cheerleader? It's a popularity contest. The most attractive person becomes a cheerleader. The whole thing, right? It's just the way it works. When people learn cultural practices by social learning or by modeling others, it is known as a transmitted culture. If you watch your neighbor growing tomatoes in a hanging pot, you have learned from planting practices by such planting practices by observation. We're going to stop right here because these guys are really kind of interesting. They're kind of like you guys in the Apache. Just wait until we talk about them. Have totally different culture.